I'm William Graper, and this is The Recovering Elitist, a show that explores the space between who we appear to be and who we actually are, the tension, our transformations, and the truth behind success. Choyce Tibbits, welcome to The Recovering Elitist. I have to admit, I'm a relatively new fan to the fan club, but I'm so glad that I found you, and I'm so happy that you're here today because I think you really think critically about our culture in a way that's really rare. You don't flinch from contradiction, and you seem to hold both yourself and the culture to a higher standard, which I really appreciate. You also talk about curation and discernment and the value of excellence in a world that often confuses those things with arrogance. You and I both are fascinated by this averaging of culture or aspiring to the middle. That tension between aspiration and accessibility, taste and belonging is a world that I linger in a lot, and I think you speak to that so beautifully. We'll dive into all of it, but first, I want to start at the beginning. You're from a tiny, wealthy suburb of San Diego called Rancho Santa Fe, which, among other things, it's known for its massive lawns and its outrageous use of water, Barack Obama at the country club, and is home to my uncle, actually. What was it like growing up in such a particular bubble?
I think like any bubble, you don't necessarily realize that it's different until you come in contact with an external. You don't necessarily know what it is until you come across something different. And for me, I saw progression as my family's business grew and like our position changed. So, and I was just a bit older. So like I've always had a very kind of clear understanding of where I am in relation to others and how that shifted with different external circumstances. But it's definitely a unique experience. But I think one of the reasons I think the way that I do now is because I was able to be in those very particular environments, but then also brush up against others that were completely polar opposites.
So what did that environment teach you early on about image and success?
Oh, so many things. I think both the environment, also my family dynamic. I think do a little background is that my parents are entrepreneurs, and specifically they're entrepreneurs within an aesthetic space. And so that I think also has really guided the way that I look at the world. Also, it's funny, I recently connected that with like my interest in fashion. They weren't in fashion at all. They were in like home and interiors, but there's an overall aesthetic taste value that I've always been around. It's been every single part of like my life. It's always been a conversation and presentation, and just that has always been a priority. And that's kind of across the board in those kind of environments in general, as you're probably aware of, working in interiors yourself. And so I think that's definitely was something that it taught me. Also, the importance of the relationships. I think that's like such a big one, and just in how you navigate the world. And even with the most subtle things, I was just actually did a piece of content around this recently because I get nerdy. And there's this idea called habitus, which is like a sociology idea. And it's exactly that, this ingrained behavior you don't even really understand you have until you come up against someone who actually doesn't have it. And then you see someone else who does, and you can like clock it. It's like being at a dinner party, and like kind of you can tell with a world that someone comes from, like a 10-minute conversation. And that is also something I think that environment taught me, because it has allowed me to just navigate spaces really fluidly.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fascinated by your mom. As you would leave the house growing up, your mom would say, don't embarrass yourself and don't embarrass this family. And as somebody who I grew up taking etiquette classes and doing cotillion and...
Yeah, 5th grade.
Yeah, exactly. Like learning how to do all of the setting of the table and eating a certain way. And I ended up going on to be an escort for debutante. My sisters were debutantes and that whole thing. So I really want to dive into this with you, this idea that aesthetics are important, presentation is important, how people perceive you is important. Did you ever feel like that was pressure, or do you look back on it as pressure?
I don't personally, because of just who I am. But I can see how others can have a completely different experience with it. I think my personality type is built for that kind of pressure, and I actually encourage that kind of pressure in my life. And that may just be because of environment, and that's what I consider to be quote unquote normal. But it is saying it with no context seems kind of intense. Like, don't embarrass yourself, don't embarrass this family. Like, damn, it's a lot. But I totally understand where that idea comes from. And then as I've gotten older, I've also been able to have a understanding of kind of where I'm willing to put that pressure on myself and where I kind of need a bit of a reprieve to like refill the tank so that I can like go out and do that. I don't know if work is the right word, but put that level of like effort and intention into interactions. And then also having people who you can totally erase all of that and just be completely just like weird and wacky. And I think that's like why like having like strong support systems, friends, like my partner is like completely opposite to me, but that's actually why it works, because I can just like be that like super just like someone I heard refers it to like taking the crown off. I think I like that kind of that reference. So that I think you need those people too.
Yeah, it's funny because my partner will make fun of me because he's like, "You're so about manners," and you're like scarfing down your food and talking with your mouth full. And I'm like, yeah, it's because I know the standard and I'm choosing to say I'm not going to do the standard now. I want to be a mess right now. But it's when you don't have the standard and you're eating like that, I have a problem.
Yeah. It's that thing about you can break the rules once you know what the rules are.
Exactly. Yeah. And you're somebody who actually advocates for the rules, and you have said, I don't make the rules. And I find you to sort of strategically work within the rules. I think of manners as being a cultural rule. And I want to know your thoughts on manners and etiquette and that kind of presentation in the world we live in today, which would deem a lot of those things elitist. And they definitely have roots in classism, racism, and a lot of other things. So, what are your thoughts on what role etiquette and presentation has in the world today?
I think they're so important because back to the point of this idea of like habitus and socialization and like over time, like embodiment, people respond to that without even knowing what it is. So even though we can say cognitively, this is a elitist idea, this is rooted in XYZ, the reality is when you come across it and you are like, oh, I like that person. That's what's happening. You know what I mean? So on the other end of it, I think it's important to know that it has value. So to your point, like choosing to lean in if you want to have success in certain spaces.
You're saying there's kind of like a subliminal messaging going on that you may not even notice about a person, that you're like, I really like being around this person, and it could be because of the way they're presenting.
Yeah, totally. And that goes across so many different things. Presentation, like image, like beauty is another big one. Like there have like been studies about like face shape and like literally like the way that your brain responds to like face shape. And that's just based off of like over time cultural ideals of what is like appealing or not. And all of these things are having real impact on us. And there are some parts of it that you can totally have control over. Like, yes, you may not be able to control your face shape, like maybe with a bit of filler. But like there are other things like kind of understanding like you're saying, the rules and manners of a particular space and XYZ. So people who prioritize growth, and that's actually like a big value for me. Like I'm always trying to get better at anything I'm doing. And so in order to do that, you have to know where your shortcomings are, and then also know the system that you're trying to operate in.
Yes. So we're going to bounce around a little bit because there's so many things I want to talk to you about. But when you talk about that system that exists, what do you think it is about you that allows you to say, I'm willing to work within the system, as opposed to let's burn the system down?
Yeah, great question. I'd say there's a level of living in reality that you have to put over the let's burn it to the ground if that's what your priority is. I think a great example of this is when people say, let's build our own table. I think that idea is a bit misleading because at the end of the day, there's such a delta in the power dynamic where the power player's table is so much bigger. It doesn't matter how many people are at your table. At some point, someone from that table needs to go to the other table and then can maybe integrate the tables. That actually will do much more for you than just working in a table that is like a tenth of the size with a tenth of the impact. And so I think that's a layer of the reality that you have to put on things. If seeing change and burning it to the ground is something that you want, you don't necessarily need to burn it to the ground to see the results that you want. Like what's the end game and what's the smartest, most strategic way to get to the end game? And sometimes that means doing things that maybe at a first glance are opposed to your kind of immediate wants, but long term. It's like, what do they say? Lose the battle, win the war type of thing.
So what's an example in your own life where you've decided instead of creating my own table, I'm going to join the larger table and I'm going to make an impact through working within the system?
I can do a whole dissertation on this, but people talk about Andre Leon Talley, for example. And I did a video and someone actually posted a comment because she had said something about like tokenism or something and how no one really valued him and like look at like how things ended up. But also I think on the other end of that, there's an insane level of sacrifice and honoring that we have to do for someone who does that, because there are so many Black people who are now in fashion because he did that and was that singular person who was in the room to change the narrative of what it meant to be a Black person in fashion. And then also people were able to see someone who looks like them. And a lot of times, like, people really do need to see a mirror to, what do they say? If you can see it, you can be it. I don't personally believe in that. I don't care what you look like or where you come from. Like, what does my grandma say? Take the meat, spit out the bones. But a lot of people cannot think through something unless they see it reflected back at them in the way they are. And like that type of person, that's an example of someone who went to the other table and then by being at the other table was able to bring a whole other slew of people there too. And that's one of the examples I use all the time, specifically like within the fashion space. There are just so many layers to his impact. And I think that we forget that there's a lot of sacrifice that comes with that too. And it's also a very thankless job, especially from people that look like you who don't understand the long game that you're playing.
Yeah, some of that infighting is actually harder than the outsiders. You know, it's like within the gay community and how hard we are on each other versus, you know, other people being hard on us. It's wild to watch that. You know, you talk about loving growth and output, and this is where you and I are very aligned. You said that those growth and output are both very big values for you, and that you say, I am the work is me. There is no separation, and I treat my life like one big project. I stopped in my tracks when I read that because this is the exact place that I am in my life where I feel like I've come to call that the life of an artist. And you may not identify as an artist, but it's essentially like when your life becomes the art and the art is your life, it's all one expression.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
Talk to me more about that.
I'm a huge believer in that, and actually was like rewatching Rick Owens' interview on his podcast, Fashion Neuroses, which is great. He talks about this idea of his life and the work being so intertwined, like there's no separation. And actually also just recently met Martha Stewart, which is a very cool experience. And
wow,
I feel so seen by just the way she navigated her career. In her documentary, there's a part where she's talking about her relationship to emotions. And like, I remember pausing and rewinding. She was like, that's just not really interesting to me. Like, what are we doing? What are we doing? And like, that is exactly how I feel too. I've gotten better at like having more empathy and all of those things. But like, there are some people who their personality type is really output based and it seeps into everything they do. And in the same panel, actually, that when I met her, someone asked about how she's able to do everything. And her response was so nonchalantly, she was like, well, that's just work. She just treats it all as her life is work. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. It's not for everyone, but I think culturally, we want to vilify people who choose to make that their reality, which I don't necessarily think is fair. Because I think a lot of times people who have that as their like goal and ambition don't say that about others who don't. If you want a soft life, that's great. Do that. But I just don't feel like that same grace is given for others who are on the other side of that.
I think it's such a good point because I think about like Hallmark and Lifetime movies where the girl goes to the big city and she's villainized for wanting a big career and she needs to come home and like basically be Christian and get married. And that's like what is valuable. And so this kind of like living a softer, more emotionally in touch life is something we culturally value. It's something that I certainly have gotten hung up on. You know, I went to school to become a clinical psychologist at one point. Like I almost fell too far into the world of emotions and feelings. And that does take you off of the path of doing. And people like Martha and Rick Owens is a great example. These are what I call world builders.
Yeah.
And you either want to be a part of the world or you don't. And they don't really care.
Yeah.
It makes relationships, I think, a little bit difficult because you're basically saying join us or don't. But if you don't, you're probably going to be left behind. What's it like for you sort of navigating your personal life when work and output is such a priority?
I think it's being open with people and making sure I'm surrounded by people who understand that it's not personal. Like, it's not a personal thing if I don't see you for 6 months. It's like I and also too, at the same time, we mentally only have so much capacity. Emotionally, we only have so much capacity. So you have to prioritize what that is. There becomes a period where the tank gets full. And even if you try to continue to output emotionally, it just gets weaker and weaker because you're at capacity. And so having a clear awareness of what you are prioritizing at specific moments in your life, and then being honest with people who are around you who also have an understanding that it's not about them, it's just about where you are. Being able to meet somewhere in the middle, I think, is important.
I have a friend who's always talking about leaning into what she calls ordinary misery.
Oh, tell me more. That sounds interesting.
Yeah, that like life is ultimately about the ordinary things. And with that comes sort of an ordinary misery, which is, we all experience. It's some people could call it boredom. I reject and rebuke that. I have so much trouble accepting my ordinariness. And in some ways, what we're talking about, these world builders, there's a maniacal sort of healthy level of delusion.
You have to have it.
You have to have it.
You have to have it.
Yeah, and I wanna know your relationship to that because I think anytime I lean into being ordinary and not being the exception to the rule, I, can't leave the bed. I have to believe that I'm the exception to the rule or I won't get anything done, and that's just a way of psyching myself out.
Yeah, my therapist and I were just talking about singularity of purpose. And I think part of that is being able to hype yourself up to get to a place that you aren't yet. And so sometimes to do that, to your point, you have to psychologically be your own cheerleader in a way that to others may be considered a bit delulu. But I think that's really important because the reality is the world is constantly trying to tear you down. Everywhere you turn, there's things that are trying to diminish that kind of light and drive, or even just your own self-worth. So you can't really put emphasis and all of your cards on external things, people, places to do that. You have to also be able to do it for yourself. If other people do it too, great. That's added to the list. But at the end of the day, if no one else does, I am. So let's go.
I'm looking for cheerleaders only.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, you may not look at me in my life and think that I carry self-doubt, but I walk around with enough self-doubt for all of America. So I don't really need anyone else's. I need
Yeah.
to cancel that out with some level of delusion.
Totally.
Because otherwise I'll just get swallowed whole. And I think this dovetails into spending some time on elitism, because I think that elitism is something that you and I are both interested in this topic, certainly. I am calling myself in the show the recovering elitist because there's a part of me that has always used being the best, looking the best, doing the best, having the best with elitism. And I'm trying to come down to earth while also admitting that I'm a bit of an elitist. I like what you say about elitism and how to curate something, you have to keep things out. And that is exclusion. But it only becomes elitism when exclusion is the goal. Talk to me about that.
Yeah. So first off, to rewind, one of the reasons I was so interested in this podcast was but from the name itself, I was just like, oh, this is interesting. Because this idea of elitism is so prevalent in culture, especially because we're told that everyone should be the same. Everything should be the same. Everyone should have the same access to things. But the reality is that that's just not true. I am not a professional dancer. I love to dance, but there are people who are much better than dancing at me. And that's just a reality. And I don't know why it's bad to be elite at something. That I actually saw a really funny Threads post. It was imagine confusing literacy with elitism. That's actually where we are culturally. It's if someone has an ability to critical think, actually not just take an opinion as fact, be able to look at something in a 360 way, that's actually not elitist. That's actually just being educated. But specifically like in online culture, that's seen as elitist. And so recently I found myself Googling, is elitism bad? Culturally, all these people are telling me that I should not want to be the best, be elite at anything. I should just want to kind of be like everyone else. And so as I got into the wormhole, being the nerd that I am, I came across a lot of this like research and kind of commentary about how it's not actually elitism if you are valuing curation and excellence, but it's when those things don't exist and you're just using exclusion to keep people out, that's elitism. The example of curation I think is great because a whole part of curating is not actually what you're putting in, but it's what you're actually taking out of the space. And so that literally is just excluding things. But we think of like a museum as like this like great place of kind of curation, but the reality is that a bunch of stuff is getting looked at and said, no, this, we shouldn't include this. No, this doesn't work. No, this isn't good enough. That's not a bad thing because at the same time, you're going to walk through the exhibit and be like, wow, this is so well curated. So I think it's just being more intentional about the language that we use and not overlaying such a heavy, contextually rich word like elitism across everything. Just because I'm literate and know how to like critical think does not make me an elitist.
I've come to feel like elitism is tied up with ego and arrogance in a way, and we can use anything to inflate our ego or be arrogant. So I think there are mothers who value being a mother to a point that they would feel elitist at being a mother. I think that there are people who go to certain universities that feel elitist because they went to a certain university. The way that I look at it is like we can use anything to inflate our ego and have an elitist arrogance about us with any choice we make. Because to your point, we're all curating our lives and making choices. And oftentimes we're making the choice that we think is best.
Yes.
And who defines best? Who defines greatest? Who defines prettiest? So everyone should be an elitist about everything that they choose to do with their life.
Totally. I think you actually make a great point about, I love how you use the mother example and then also use this idea of you're making what you think is the best choice. I'm really fascinated in this, this tension amongst mothers, amongst people who like shame other women for not being mothers. You're making a choice to not have a kid. And to you, that's like the best choice. But the fact that other person who maybe has kids and decided to have kids, the fact that you made that choice is indirectly telling them that you think that the other choice is the bad choice. And they're responding to that. But there's so many logic leaps that you made to get there. And that's also going back to this idea that everyone's the same. That's assuming that we're exactly the same. No, we have completely different lives, we have completely different wants, completely different ambitions. But so much of, I think the response comes from that. It's like, oh, you made that choice. And because I made this other choice, you're indirectly telling me that my choices are bad.
Yes, and indirectly is a very important thing to linger on because a lot of it is subconscious and we sit on our phones and we see other people's lives and we get into the comparing and despairing loop. And then we just start thinking, they have this thing and I don't have it. So instead of looking at my own choices, I'm going to demonize their choices and say, these people are wrong or these people are elitist. And the origins of elitism do come with a lot of cultural baggage and systemic baggage around hierarchy and around exclusion. So I think that the idea that when exclusion is the goal, that's when it's a problem and that's when elitism is, for lack of a better word, wrong, I think is an important distinction that you're making.
Yeah, I think there's another kind of cultural layer here. Because America is so rooted on this idea of quote unquote equality, which I think is actually so funny because if you actually read a textbook, that's so not true. But like that is the propaganda that this country is built off of. Like this kind of egalitarianness, like this kind of like free man idea that it's really hard for us to actually digest any sort of hierarchy. You don't find that same level of response to something like elitism in other countries. And I think it's because those countries were, one, because they're older, have always had hierarchies because at one point there were like kings and queens there. So like there's always been this idea that, oh, okay, I'm here, you're here. Or like they've had caste systems. Like there's just a completely different culture around it so that just the idea that it's happening isn't such a shock. But in America, I think the idea that when it just happens and it's like, because it's the reality across the board, people are shocked about it. And it's like, you even find that in the corporate environment, since I also am like a corporate girly. It's like interesting to me when companies try to equalize the company and kind of treat everyone the same. But the reality is like any business is not the same. An executive is not the same as a low-level employee. And like this idea we're all the same, but like we're not though.
Yeah.
So like, why don't we just be honest about
It doesn't feel like a lie.
that? Literally. And I feel like that's a very American cultural perspective.
Yeah, it feels dishonest and not the whole truth, which I really struggle with.
Just because we don't like it doesn't mean it's not happening. And don't vilify the person who's stating what's happening as advocating for it or going against you, because I just have my eyes open. You know?
We're going to talk about that because you have a few videos that you've done that I think really touch on that. So we're going to come to that. But I do want to also just touch on what you said about the caste and hierarchy of Europe and how there's like a built-in sort of understanding of that. I would also argue that in America anyway, there's like a deference to God and
Yeah.
Jesus Christ. And it's interesting how we don't believe in hierarchy, but we're willing to say that there's some higher power that's like greater than us. I could really go off on a tangent about that. Maybe as human beings, we're not allowed to have a caste system, but spiritually we are. I don't know. It's also interesting how people are so quick to reject elitism while carrying a Louis Vuitton bag.
Totally. I had a whole conversation with actually someone about this. I wish I could articulate what they said, but it was exactly that. It's like people can't hold that duality at the same time. And to me, it's like, why not? They can happen at the same time.
But also just supporting the very systems that make elitism possible and the totems that make elitism possible and separating class through objects.
Totally.
What's your relationship like to gatekeeping, and are gatekeepers necessary?
Oh, I'm very much a pro gatekeeper, but gatekeeping is a similar thing to elitism in terms of language. We use a singular word to actually talk about 8,000 different things, and we just use that one word, and then that one word now carries a very negative connotation. But I think one of the positives of gatekeeping is that it keeps the integrity of a space. Because going back to the fundamental idea, we're not all the same. We don't all value things the same way. And so this is something as like a social media strategist, I've been thinking about a lot, mainly around this idea of algorithmic distribution of content, and which is basically passive content. If you are a scroller online, you actually have zero kind of, not control isn't the word, but
Choice.
Yeah, zero choice of what you're getting. You're a passive consumer to all that information. And so because the algorithm is not prioritizing what's best, but just what's going to keep you on the longest, it'll start to show everyone the same things, right?
I think like gatekeeping in general there's such a pushback against it because people think, well, now we have this democratization of information and everybody has access to everything. But to your point, the algorithms actually make you think that you have access to everything, but really you don't. You're being fed what they want you to look at. And that actually is what scares me more than anything, because it feels like now we went from having a lot of experts in a lot of different fields and doing what they did really well to like having 2 or 3 tech companies that disseminate all information.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's like another really good point about the democratization. It's democratization of visibility. Everyone has an equal opportunity to be seen. We all have the same level of visibility because of the internet, and I think that's amazing. The fact that someone living in like a rural area has the same opportunity for visibility as me in like a hub like New York City. Like that's actually an amazing thing.
But do you believe that's true? I want to just stop you and ask you, do you believe that it's true that we all have access to the same ability to be seen?
I think the internet does allow that. Yes, the distribution may be different, but the fact that you are putting it online, it's like a great equalizer until it comes to specific like algorithmic distribution of it.
Yes. Because I'm like, if you take your shirt off, you could probably be seen. Or if you talk about Trump, you could probably be seen. But if you're not a gym bro with his shirt off talking about Trump, who's seeing you? It's hard.
That's the part where the algorithm becomes a bit sinister. And then also, too, what's the priority of the platform? Because at the end of the day, the platform's trying to make money, keep people on the longest, support advertisers, et cetera, et cetera. So like the things that align with those objectives are going to be more highly distributed. Someone explained it really well. They talked about the internet being a library. The library used to be only available to certain people. Information used to only be available to certain people. The internet has now allowed anyone to go into the library, but there's no librarians. And actually the librarians have an ulterior motives who are like the platforms.
Mm-hmm.
And you are just put into a room with billions of books, and it's up to you to figure out what book to go to, while fighting the new librarians who have ulterior motives, if that makes sense. That is the positive and negative of the internet. Yes, you're in the space with all the information, but if you're not intentional about what you're inputting, then you can be steered in a direction that's not necessarily advantageous for you or positive for you.
And thus becomes sort of the averaging of culture. And AI is the averaging of creativity.
Yeah, it's like figuring out what the lowest common denominator is to get eyes on something as much as possible.
Well, speaking of gatekeeping, you studied business and consumer insights at Fordham. So I trust what you're saying because I believe in experts and organizations. But I want to touch on some of your most talked about reels. So for those of you listening who don't know, Jay has an incredible Instagram and TikTok following where he is talking about the culture, talking about fashion, and I would say you're more of a critic than critiquing. But I think you look at things from all sides. And you once did a video about Taylor Swift and the averaging of culture. Talk to me about that and specifically about that sort of selling of relatability.
I wouldn't say I'm a Swiftie, but I like a lot of her music. But every time there's a lot of noise around her, I'm not shocked. But it's always like a wow of how big she actually is. Because if you take everything about her, the music, her image, her technical singing ability, if you take all of those things, there are a plethora of other already very famous artists who are much better at those things. They're not even close to the size of Taylor Swift. But so why is that? And it's because she has this level of relatability where it's very easy to put yourself in those shoes and feel like you can do it too. In a way that when you like watch an Ariana Grande sing, it's like, I cannot sing like that. And that, even though there is such appreciation that can be done for that level of art, it's also a barrier because people feel like it's not relatable to them, which I feel like is sad. That's not good art to me. Like I want to be around people who are excellent in things that I'm not in. And I want to like have a wide range of those type of people. So yeah, I think she's a great example of that. But like you cannot deny the fact that she's not the best singer. So it's like very copy paste. It's not incredibly lyrically rich. It is in terms of like storytelling, but those stories are very relatable. It's not layered in terms of context. It's not like Rosalia. Like the recent, like we're filming this right after the Rosalia Berghain video came out. And that is so incredibly layered with references and history and language. And like, that's not what Taylor Swift is doing. But all of those people I've mentioned are not where near as big as her. And so I think that's a great example of this idea of American exceptionalism being similar to this middleness. Going back to this idea of elitism, it's like it's bad to be excellent at something. It's looked down upon. That's kind of depressing to me.
It's depressing, but I would also say it's capitalism.
Totally. You want to reach as many people as possible.
Exactly. And ultimately, you're wanting everybody to feel comfortable and safe, and that you don't want the conversation to be too difficult. We don't really want to deal with anything complicated when life feels hard enough as is. But I would always rather have the harder conversation, even if I don't look like an outsider through the things that I have on the outside. I have always internally felt like an outsider and a critic and a contrarian. So the Rosalias are the ones I'm looking at.
Yeah, totally. And also, like, I want to learn.
Yeah, aspire.
Exactly. I want to like aspire. I want to get better. I just don't want my own experience mirrored back at me. Like, why would I want that? I live my own experience every day. I had an old director who used to say that social media can either be a mirror or a window, but it's up to the person to like consciously make the choice of what they're using it as. But the default is that it's going to be a mirror because a mirror is what's going to get you to stay and engage the longest. And back to capitalism, that's what's going to make the platform the most money. But if you're intentional, there's literally almost nothing you can't get from the internet. But you have to make a conscious effort to do it. Like you have to put the work in. And that's something that, because of how algorithms work and how like frictionless environments that social media creates, that is now a lot of people's default. So the idea that you have to actually do any sort of work is like kind of out of the question. To me, I'm always looking up stuff.
Pile it on. You made a video about Soho House and they're going private again. And Soho House was a private company, then went public, and then ultimately has become private again. And the idea being that exclusivity doesn't scale.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, like, about the balance between access and aspiration in culture.
I actually would love to talk to someone at Soho House to like, and this would probably be like a closed door meeting, but if their plan was always to do this, to like expand, because the reality to me that wouldn't make sense. Because you need upfront capitals to make more houses, going public is kind of the only way to do that. It gives you like a huge influx of capital at once. And what happened in like these few years that they were public is they've opened a bajillion houses all over the world. And so like to me, I'm like, maybe this was their plan all along, because going public for a private members club is counterintuitive. Like what people are actually buying into is this kind of level of safety, security, exclusivity that the club provides. And so if you then have to prioritize shareholders and like quarterly growth, that means you have to get more people in the door. That's going to kind of broaden the aperture of what you're willing to accept. And that when they were getting insane amounts of complaints about just how the houses were insanely crowded. I jokingly say that like over the summer, at some point, it felt like the Hunger Games trying to get a bed at the pool. And it's just like not necessarily the experience that you're buying into. I think that capitalist aspect, like that you mentioned, is really real. And yeah, that balance is really important. And something else I've been thinking about too is that like capitalism and creativity can coexist, but they're not friends. It takes a lot of work for them to kind of have a strong dance. Because on polar opposites of the spectrum, creativity is very specific, while capitalism is all about like scale and breadth. And so it's like, how do you balance that? And since I'm a fashion person and specifically like very interested in fashion business, like I think LVMH is a really good example. The reason why that business works is because of the scale, because a lot of those businesses are not making money. Most of the money is coming from Vuitton, even though they have 80 other brands. That's why some of those brands can really focus on creativity, heritage, like positioning, because they can sell the Louis Vuitton Neverfull that all of America is going to have once they like get their first job. And that's a somewhat approachable price point. And so that's why that works. Yeah, it's a very like nuanced and layered discussion.
Yeah, it's also counter to what you and I both love about YSL, which is that it's unapologetically elitist and it has such a clarity of vision. And so it's like, because YSL doesn't try to please everybody, they actually stand out to me as being great. And they do make a lot of money.
Totally.
So it's interesting how sometimes that exclusivity scales, sometimes it doesn't. But probably, relatively speaking, YSL is not a huge business. I mean, it's big, but it's not like Meta or something.
But also, like, not every business needs to be a multi-billion-dollar business.
Yeah, when did we start thinking that everything had to be a multi-billion-dollar business? It's crazy.
No, it's so true. That's okay. It's okay to be in $100 million business.
Yeah. If you started a cookie company and you were selling $100 million worth of cookies, you'd be fucking happy. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And also, growth does not only mean revenue. Growth can be in terms of cultural depth, like positioning of where it's sold. There are so many other layers of things that can be a growth to a business outside of just making more dollars. But I think another really great example is The Row. But like all those are businesses where like they didn't have to answer to those external people. They could 100% focus on what they wanted to do.
Right.
And just stick to that the entire time.
Well, that's where privilege comes into what we're talking about. And there's a whole other conversation. I'm going to have you back and we're going to talk about that, because ultimately the privilege that they have is that they are self-funded with endless money. So it's like they can do whatever they want, whereas Louis Vuitton has shareholders and on and on. And speaking of Louis Vuitton, also I think Jonathan Anderson at Dior is doing a little bit of this too. Have you noticed how they're all coming for Ralph Lauren? They're doing this like white American,
the polo shirt,
like country club. Yeah. I want to talk to you about MAGA and basically, I think it's connected to what's going on in fashion right now at Dior and Louis Vuitton. These campaigns are so conservative leaning, and they're connected.
Well, I'm really fascinated though about that. And I had this discussion after Jonathan Anderson's menswear collection. It was like straight up Ralph Lauren. But what I find interesting from like a business positioning perspective is that America is not the biggest market. It's a big market. I remember after that show, I went to the LVMH's quarterly report to look at the breakdown of the regions. And if you combine like Asia, if you combine the other ones, it's much bigger than America. But the creative vision is so rooted to, like you're saying, in this very American conservativeness. And that is not the case at other places.
But there's a fetishism that goes on with the Americana and the American way. Like my French friends are like obsessed with a polo and a popped collar. Like anything American, they're just like, they die for. So
it's so funny. They don't want to live in America.
You don't want to live in America.
They don't want to live in America at all, but they're fascinated by like this idea of America. But it's not, but once again, it's the idea of America.
But that same fetishism of Asia and Europe with the sort of American looking aesthetic, I think the reason why I bring up MAGA and conservatism and Trump and all of that is because I think as we dance into a more conservative culture and political landscape in this country, there is a fetishization or fetishism of this weird conservative aesthetic that I'm like, we're fighting for our rights in the streets, but also like becoming more conservative in the way we're dressing. There's something connected there, and I can't really put my finger on it yet, but they're tied together.
Yeah. And I think part of that, though, is that we talked a bit about the landscape of America right now. And that's not even just America, the world. There's a lot happening. Like it just reading the news will get your nervous system all the way up. And so one aspect of conservative nature, values, aesthetics is that they're familiar. They're not new. It's old. Coming back to something that's super familiar feels safe to me, and that it makes a lot of sense. It's like similar to what I was saying about after New York Fashion Week happened, where everyone was talking about like how minimal and like simple everything was. I'm like, yeah, but that makes sense though, because people don't have a lot of space to ingest crazy creativity, because what they're ingesting is all the crazy stuff happening in the world. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
Look at how they outwardly express. Yeah, it's a bit simpler.
I love that you say this because I often get stuck thinking about very niche, weird things. And one of them is that in every movie of the future, in some dystopic world where we're all half dead and we're like half aliens, there's so many accessories. And the hair is so crazy and the outfits are so futuristic. And I'm like, in the future, when the world is burning, you are not going to be reaching for a necklace. Like there's no accessorizing.
That's funny.
You're going to be exhausted. You're going to be like, this is going to get caught on something. You are not going to be doing your hair like that. You're probably going to have a shaved head.
I've never actually thought of that, but that's like actually really real.
Totally. What do you hope people notice more deeply after engaging with your commentary and your content?
I try my best, going back to like learning something, I try to give perspective in a way that anyone can ingest and have a universal takeaway. Something I'm always trying to do is do content that is of value, but not only value for a particular audience. Have a really wide range of like universal human insights within my content that people can find valuable or can spark conversation or can get people to start to think about something differently, even if they don't necessarily agree with me. That's something I kind of actually love when I get comments about that. It's like people are like, I don't always necessarily agree with what you said, but you always get me to think about something in a totally different way. And I think there needs to be more of that in culture, because I think part of the reasons for where we are, it's that you must be exactly like me, think exactly like me, have the same perspective as me, or it's bad. And I don't think that's right, because there's so much growth that happens from those moments of tension. And I just do those conversations through the lens of fashion, culture, strategy. And so that's kind of always my end goal. Like I'm always putting things like a topic through that filter. And I'm always kind of working it out from a like storytelling perspective so that it's not crazy polarizing. Because so many people instantly react to certain topics or ideas or even words to where they can't even hear a full perspective. And so I really try to play my semantics to where people can get to the universal human insight or takeaway or learning. And that's one of the reasons why my audience is so diverse. I have this really funny list of like notable people that follow me, and it is across the board, like people who like you would not even put in the same category, but that's what I love. I'm like, great, okay, I'm doing something right.
I think because you're willing to use those words that scare people and then also give them context and tell them a story, they're able to see themselves, and we can see each other more clearly through that commentary. You're helping me clarify why I call this show The Recovering Elitist, because there is inherently, by saying that, there is a tension between the two things. It's like, I'm inherently admitting that I am an elitist, but I'm also admitting that I'm learning and growing and evolving, and that it's both things. It's both things. We're going to do a few rapid fires and then get you out of here. Describe your relationship with elitism in one word.
Oh, layered.
Good one. Balenciaga's revamp.
My first word was understandable. It's very much rooted in like the original Cristobal work. And I think Pier Paolo has a challenge up his sleeve balancing both the kind of cult following and influence Demna had, which was like a completely different aesthetic, and what he's going to try to bring to the table, which I think is going to be more rooted in like the couture nature of what Cristobal was doing back in whenever he was alive.
Melania Trump and fashion.
Oh, it's maybe problematic, but outside of Jackie Kennedy, I think she's probably one of the best dressed first ladies we have, but no one wants her.
Wow. Big statement.
Yeah. I think it's just true.
Okay. Lastly, what are you currently obsessed with, creatively or intellectually?
Oh, great question. I'm very fascinated by our cultural response to AI. We're at this period where there's a huge delta in what the technology can do and its impact and what consumer perception is around it. And we need to bridge that gap, and marketing advertising is really one of the best ways to do that. You can kind of see it already starting to happen with these very human-focused AI ads. And like that is strategy to get perception shift around this tool, because actually the technology is much further than what's being implemented, but people have such a hard time digesting the impact of where it is now. And I think bridging that gap was a really interesting challenge, and I'd like to do it. So if anyone's listening to this who is looking for a strategist to work on that, just hit my DMs.
Jay's your guy. Well, Jay, thank you so much for coming on today and talking with us. I feel like you are just a fearless commentator. I'm so happy to have found you, to be a part of your fan club. And I'd love for you to tell us more about where we can learn about you and connect with you online.
Yeah, so across all social, specifically like TikTok, Instagram, and it's just my name. It's at J Tibbitts on Instagram and at J Choyce Tibbits on TikTok. I also have a YouTube channel. It's more like vlog focused and life focused. Not as consistent there, but I have a lot of videos if you want to backtrack. And LinkedIn, of course, one of my favorite social media platforms. I very actively try to like create a dialogue with all my content. So leave a comment, leave a DM. So much of actually what I end up outputting is inspired by some of those conversations or things I see in the comments. So it's a group project.
I love that. Thank you so much, Jay. We really appreciate having you on.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun. Hi, I'm J Choyce Tibbits, and I'm a recovering elitist.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of The Recovering Elitist. Our show is produced by Christopher Michael, Kelsey McWilliams, and Sasha Grinblatt, with audio post-production by Griffin James. Special thanks to Chase Coughlin for our original theme music and Justin Teodoro for our original artwork. We'd really like to hear from you. What are you recovering from? We hope you'll join the conversation on Instagram or at therecoveringelitist.com, and we hope you'll like and subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts for new episodes each and every week. Thank you for listening.